I'm Jean-Marie Guéhenno. I'm the director of the Kent Global Leadership Program in Conflict Resolution. I apologize for wearing a mask, but I just had a little bout of COVID, and I'm fine, testing negative, but the protocol says I should wear a mask, so I wear a mask. It's really a great pleasure to be here today for the first in-person lecture of the Kent program. The Kent program is a multifaceted program. It has a visiting professor. I had the honor of being the first visiting professor. Ghassan Salamé is the second visiting professor. It organizes lectures like the one we are having today. It has fellows, and I see present and former fellows of the Kent program in the room. It has a flagship event, which is a training week for diplomats in the spring. The idea being that diplomats, and I was one of them, so I know it's true. They live in their own world, but they seldom have contacts with business, with civil society, and that if one wants to address conflict in an effective manner, you do need to connect those three pillars of society, and so that's the vision of the program. So it gives me particular pleasure today that Muhtar Kent, who is the inspiration and the supporter of this program, could be there in person. He is there when we just took the picture. You were wondering what was this mystery trio. Muhtar Kent is here with us today. Without him, obviously, the program wouldn't have happened. I'm glad also that we have two deans who have made their mark on CIPA, like Lisa Anderson and Mary Jano. Karen couldn't be here today, but she is there in spirit, and we have discussed extensively the Kent program with her. And I want to introduce now Ghassan Salamé. It's hard to think of a better person to be a visiting professor on conflict resolution, because he is this rare species of a scholar practitioner. He has written many important books. He is the founding dean of the Paris School of International Affairs. So he's a true scholar whose books are very important if one wants to understand how societies come or do not come together. But at the same time, he's also a practitioner. He worked with Lakhdar Brahimi at Taif to end the Lebanese civil war. He worked with Sergio de Mello in Baghdad, and actually miraculously survived the attack on the UN in Baghdad. He worked with Kofi Annan on Myanmar, and more recently he was the envoy of the United Nations in Libya. And in this extremely difficult case, some progress was made, and I think its commitment, shrewdness, and presence was an important and decisive factor actually in making that progress. So now today he's going to speak about the deregulation of force, and sadly it's a very topical issue. And I'm not going to discuss the deregulation of force. I leave it to you, Ghassan, to present your ideas.
Thank you, Jean-Marie. Thank you for our long friendship. Thank you for inviting me. And I would like to thank Mr. Kent for being here today and for his support to the program. And I would certainly put this in one of the five pillars of CIPA thematic approach, the geopolitical one. I would also say happy birthday to the United Nations. It is the United Nations Day today. It's a mere accident that it takes place that day. I almost died 2 or 3 times at the service of this organization, so the UN Day is not something I'm not sensitive to. Well, as you certainly know, a few months ago, in fact, on February the 24th, a large Russian group of military invaded parts of a neighboring country, that's Ukraine. There is, in the media and elsewhere as well, a clear and legitimate tendency to insist on the specificity of what's happening there. So as usual in this kind of cases, there is a lot of interest to the persona who took the decision. Who's Putin? Why is he doing that? It's a Putin fault. And there is also interest in the specificity of the Ukrainian-Russian relation. And this is also legitimate, because it's a very complicated relations in the past few centuries between these two countries, with a lot of similarities, with a lot of common history, but also with a distinctive history in the past 2 or 3 decades. But I do believe that this is, although legitimate, this reading does not go far enough. I have been thinking and working and writing in the past 2 years about the deregulation of force in the international system. And when this attack on February 24th took place, I looked at it in a different way. I looked at it as the apex or a new peak in a process that has started like 20 years ago, and that was now concerning Russia and Ukraine. But not as an isolated event in the evolution of the international system, but something that has been going on with other players or with the same players for something like 20 years. To put it shortly, I am not going to tell you what this invasion adds to this process. It's very clear that we have at least 3 or 4 reasons to worry, even if you are not Ukrainian or Russian or even European. The first thing is that for the first time in like 75 years, with the exception of what happened in the Caucasus and in the Balkans, this is the first time war is coming back to a continent that has known war most of his life, but has known peace for 75 years. And now it is tasting again the bitter taste of war. And this is something that does not in any way downplay the many other wars taking place all over the world, but it's interesting that it is coming back to a continent that thought that it has avoided war or put war behind its back. It's also important because we thought that the idea of going, invading, conquering, and annexing a neighboring country is finished. A colleague of ours, Anna Simons, has wrote a book called The End of Conquest, published 2003. The idea that you conquer territory was becoming, even when Saddam Hussein did it with Kuwait in 1990, it looked somehow out of place, that somehow archaic, that you go and you conquer a neighbor's territory. This was not to be done. So Anna Simons was probably right in thinking that she can declare the end of conquest. And here, what do you have in Ukraine? A return to an invasion, conquest, and annexation, at least part of the country. And a third reason why this war is important in this process is what happened in 1989, 1990. Most of the theory, when I had your age, in the 70s and the 80s of the 20th century, the so-called neo-realist theory of international relations always thought that when a superpower feels that it is in serious decline, it goes into a war in order to defend its status in the international system. And then the Soviet Union in 1989 was exactly in that situation of a downgrading of its international status, but also a downgrading of its influence across the world. But it did not, contrary to most expectations, launch any armed attack in order to stop that process. So the question comes, is this coming 30 years later, or is the whole theory beside the point? And finally, it's serious because every day you open your newspaper or you go into your Twitter account or whatever, and you find somebody talking about the nuclear threat. Well, I remember 25 years ago reading the first essay by Tannenbaum telling us that the use of nuclear arm is becoming a taboo and it could disappear. And she wrote her first article, I think, in 1999, and then a whole book a few years later. And we thought that the idea of nuclear war is becoming a taboo for its use, but even for its mention. And although some kind of mentioning of the nuclear arsenal Russia had was already done in 2014, when Ukraine was invaded the first time, it was now almost mentioned every day, inciting reactions from the West with countries saying, we also have nuclear weapons. So fortunately, they have not been used or not used yet. But whenever you happen to bump into somebody who is now in government and ask him, what are the chances of a recourse to a nuclear weapon, I can tell you that it was 0% 6 months ago, and now you hear people saying 20, 30%. So there is a taboo that we thought well established, and Ukraine told us that it is not established. So what happened? What happened is a deregulation of force. I mean by that immediately after the end of the Cold War, we had extremely good reason to think, like our colleague Mueller, that the war is becoming obsolete, or like Pinker, who wrote a very thick book about the better angels of our souls, that basically violence is disappearing from the international system. And there were good reasons for that. We were grown up, Jean-Marie and myself at least, in 1990, to observe that many civil wars, including the one in my country, Lebanon, were resolved thanks to the end of the Cold War, because there was no confrontation anymore. The same year, the Salvador War was resolved also peacefully. A number of things happened. The level of economic interdependence across the world was growing at a rate we haven't seen. In fact, international trade was running like 2 times or 3 times more rapidly than GNP, national GNPs. Also, democratization was taking place. You can say that around the year 2001, 2002, for the first time in history, there were more people living under a democratic regime than under an authoritarian one. So there were good reasons to be happy if you are a peace-loving individual. On top of that, no nuclear war took place despite the decline of the Soviet Union. And on top of that, the military budget of major countries started to decline. and the deployment of foreign forces in Europe declined very quickly in the years following 1990. So there were good reasons to be rather reassured by what was happening. However, I think in the very first year of this century, the three major vehicles for this hope or this optimism came to a halt, almost at the same time. The first one has to do with democratization. Democratization, after reaching a peak at the end of the 1990s, started to stagnate. Not only new countries were not becoming democratic, but some democratic countries were knowing coup d'etat. Burkina Faso, Guinea, Myanmar, Thailand, you name them, a dozen of them. And the level of democracy in recently democratic countries was somehow becoming shallow with the appearance of what I called in the book Democracy Without Democrats, and what Fareed Zakaria called illiberal democracy. But on top of that, on top of the coup and illiberal democracies, you had something else. You had, in fact, the quality of democracy going down. And if you look at the most recent assessment by the economists, they would tell you that today, not more than 6.4% of human beings are living in a truly democratic system. 6.4%. This is limited. This is limited. And the Arab Spring disappointments in Libya and Syria, in Yemen and elsewhere in Egypt, etc., in Tunisia of late, didn't help us revisit this more skeptical view of democracy. So one important vehicle of this hope was disintegrating before our eyes. And not only disintegrated, but replaced by what I call a deregulation of politics, and that's populism. What is populism if not a deregulation of politics? What do I mean by that? I mean by that populism is based on the idea that you put aside the institutions, you put aside the elites, and in fact you attack them, and you try to redefine politics as a relationship between a popular or populist, more exactly, leader and the masses. So it's stagnation of the institutions, sidelining of the elites, and this is the deregulation of politics, also called populism. The second vehicle didn't go much better. Around the same time, 2004, 2005, we started seeing that the economic interdependence vehicle is also coming to a halt. The miracle that took place before that was that the part of trade in global GNP had risen from 37% in 1988 to 61% in 2008, the year of the financial crisis. But since, it has decreased, not dramatically, like 5%. And we can see also that the FDI have declined since in an important way. More importantly, the globalization process that led to this, including a freer flow of capital and commodities, but not a freer flow of people. Quite to the contrary, what we have seen, in fact, is a sort of an obsession with migration of people that went hand in hand with a free flow of commodities and capital, as if the capital and the commodities can migrate or should migrate in a deregulated manner. But on the contrary, we have seen an over-regulation. And to give you only one example, in 1990, 15 countries had walls on their borders, 15, 1-5. Today, they are 70. So the wall between the US and Mexico is not an exception. Now people build walls. And 3 of my former colleagues at Sciences Po in Paris have written a very good study, led by Philippe Martin, which I advise you to read, that comes to the conclusion that, in fact, economic interdependence, and in particular trade, does not automatically lead to more peaceful relation. In fact, bilateral trade does that. Multilateral trade does not produce that kind of a peaceful world. The third vehicle of this hope we had 20 years ago was, of course, that societies were opened. They were opened sometimes by the will of the masses in the streets or by enlightened leaders, but more often by the IT revolution. Forcefully. In fact, many countries could not really find, at the beginning at least, a way of dealing with the real freedom given to people by the IT revolution, by the phone, by internet, you know it. But then these very governments found ways, precisely, to become the first beneficiaries of this IT revolution through the building of systems of surveillance, through the use of these in order to become themselves spine doctors. The latest book by my colleague at Sciences Po, Sergei Guriev, is exactly about that, about the fact that now dictators do not necessarily kill, but they have become all spin dictators because they have full control over trolling, over disinformation, over this kind of activities. So the magic word in the 1990s and early years of this century was convergence. There was a convergence around democratizations, economic interdependence, and open societies. And what we have since is a clearer view that this convergence, if it did not reverse on all these sectors, it has at least coming to a halt. And that is why the deregulation of politics through populism, the deregulation of economics through economic freedoms and free flow of commodities and capital, and the deregulation of social control through the IT revolution have in fact produced another factor, which is the deregulation of force. The regulation of force came when these 3 vehicles came to a halt. And I did that in the first years of this century. And what we have witnessed since is a process of emulation. What is emulation here? It is the fact that great powers started to use force without the due respect to the rules in the use of force. And when a big power does that, it tends to become a model for lesser powers. And everybody starts doing that. If the big one does that, why shouldn't I do that? So we have seen in the past 22 years a return to a deregulated use of force in international relations. It was a bit ambiguous during the Kosovo War of 1999. both humanitarian but also geopolitical. The Russians read it as a geopolitical challenge. Most of the West read it as support for a minority that was then under Serbian control. But there was no reason for ambiguity with the attack on Iraq in the year 2003. This attack on Iraq, this invasion of Iraq, which was not legitimized by the Security Council, despite the effort to have a resolution to do that, which led to a regime change in an important country and to a number of collateral effects we are suffering from until today, was the biggest then, or the peak, by the largest power of the deregulation in the use of force. You go, attack a country, invade it, occupy it, and then you try to find a reason for that. And if you don't find a reason for that, you invent one. You don't find weapons of mass destruction. You cannot really identify Saddam with the 9/11 attack. So you go, and basically you do not have any kind of legal. My former boss, Kofi Annan, paid dearly for the fact that he said that this was an illegal war, because it was an illegal war. But then, Russia understood that this is the new rule of the game, the rules of the game. So you had the second war in Chechnya that led to the election of Putin to the presidency. And then in August 2008, an invasion of Georgia and the creation of these two republics. Basically, nobody recognizes until today Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And then in 2014, the Donbass, first attack against the Donbass, the Ukraine. In 2015, a large air and then other forms deployment in Syria that saved the neck of the Syrian president. And in 2018, we started meeting or seeing the Wagner Group in Libya and a few other African countries. And it ended up with this full-fledged invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Around the same time, a bit later probably, my sinologist colleagues date that in the year 2008, there was a hardening of the Chinese foreign policy and a change in vocabulary in how China looked at itself. And 4 years later, in 2012, when Mr. Xi was elected for the first time president of China, you could see that the country was becoming not only more active, but also more active in protecting its investment and its loans all over the world. And it's true that China had become a very important economic player, taking the second position instead of Japan in the way, and having a lot of interest in the world. I will not give you, just to give you an idea, China's exchange with Africa were 10 billion in 2000. There are 255 billion this year. China has shares in 15 of Congo's 19 mining projects. China has introduced 70% of the 4G in Africa. And this also applies, though to a lesser extent, to Latin America. But during the financial crisis of 2008, we heard a new Chinese language. And this Chinese language was saying, okay, the US is not, and the West in general, cannot really be a model for us. We need to do something else. We need possibly to replace the West. And if we cannot do it, at least to establish a form of parity with the United States. And if we cannot do it, at least to impose a clear zone of influence in our neighborhood. And for that, to expel in due time the Western presence in. Again, my sinologist colleagues would tell you that through most of its history, China has always felt that the threat to China came from the West, from continental powers. And that's why the First Wall and then the Second Chinese Wall were built in order to protect the empire from continental forces coming from Eurasia. But in the 19th century, with the UK, France, and other countries attacking from the sea, the threat changed into the sea. And therefore, we should not be surprised that China, which has not gone into a real war, with one exception, many years ago, like 35 years ago with Vietnam, is now very active, doing a lot of things, simulating a blockade of Taiwan, clashing with India every now and then on the border, reclaiming islands all over the South China Sea and transforming them into military outposts, building parallel organization to the ones built by the West in 1945. So something else is happening, and my friend Kevin Rudd has, in a recent essay in Foreign Affairs, summarized this change by saying Xi has pushed politics to the extreme left, economics to the Marxist left, and foreign policy to the extreme right, So nobody was surprised by the tone taken by the president in the 19th Congress 5 years ago, and even less in the latest Congress, the 20th Congress recently, when he said that he would not exclude or the use of force to implement the unification of the Chinese territory, which means basically Taiwan. Now, this is the US, especially in Iraq. This is Russia, in Ukraine, Georgia, and elsewhere. This is China. Well, what about the lesser powers? The lesser powers started to do exactly the same. I can't, in a short time like this, go into the military behavior or use of force by mid-sized powers or by what are called now the little Spartas across the world, but it is clear that a dozen, possibly 15 countries in the world have used force without authorization from the Security Council, without real legal basis for their use of force. Well, I can name a few of them, but you know them and you know other ones. It is not by accident that the Iranian leadership can say today that they rule not only Tehran, their own capital, but also 4 other capitals. That is Sana'a in Yemen, Damascus in Syria, Baghdad in Iraq, and Beirut in Lebanon. And this was not done in a peaceful manner. I can also mention Israel, of course. Israel has been very active, destroying any possibility for a nuclear power to emerge but itself. Israel is a nuclear power, but does not want any other nuclear power in that part of the world, so it destroyed the nuclear facility in Iraq. It destroyed a similar one in northern Syria a few years ago, and it is very active in Syria every day, destroying the smart missiles Iran is sending. There is at least one weekly attack by Israel against Syrian targets or Iranian targets in Syria right now. Turkey. Turkey is very active. Turkey is very, very active. Turkey is active in Libya. It changed entirely the balance of power in Libya in the spring of 2019. It's active in Syria. It's active in Somalia, where it has the biggest military base abroad. It has another one in Qatar. It's active in the Eastern Mediterranean. It has been active helping Azerbaijan against Armenia. And it is active militarily in all these places. And it also threatens neighboring Greece. Recently, President Erdogan has gone as far as saying one day the Greeks will wake up and find that we had attacked them during the night. But there are smaller countries than Israel or Iran or Turkey trying to do the same. Some of the Gulf countries are very wealthy, are spending huge amounts of money and sometimes using them in the Horn of Africa or in Libya or elsewhere. 2 African countries are very active in their use of force, sometimes as blue berets and sometimes through more or less ambiguous agreements in the famous war on terror, to which I'll come back later. And these 2 countries are Chad, active in 4 countries as far as I know, and more importantly, Rwanda. Rwanda, where before taking power in his own country, Kagame has been active helping Museveni rule Uganda. And then you have this rather ambiguous situation of Rwandan troops serving as blue helmets and at the same time as warriors against terror on a unilateral base in countries like République Centrafricaine or in Darfur, in Mali, in South Sudan, and elsewhere. And now you can see Rwandan forces in Mozambique as well. So I gave you all these examples. I think that one important thing here is emulation. Great powers do not only affect their neighbors or their targets, they also affect the behavior of smaller countries in the international system. And what we have seen with the big powers using force without legal foundation or customary foundation has sort of been emulated by lesser powers and continues to be emulated by lesser powers in their own area. This has affected very much international law. And this has affected one important rule in international law. That is the famous prohibition of conquest and annexation of another country's sovereign country territory in Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter. That article has been hotly debated in San Francisco when the charter was being written. Because you have 2 somehow different principles, not necessarily contradictory, but different principles included in that prohibition of annexation or use of force. On the one hand, you have the prohibition of sort of attacking the integrity of your neighbor's territory, but on the other hand, you have the principle of self-determination. If you look very carefully at what has happened since, you will find that the interpretation of that article has been extremely restrictive for many decades. For many decades, the International Court of Justice, the Security Council, the General Assembly had a very restrictive interpretation of this Article 2, Paragraph 4. 2 exceptions were given. The Article 42 and 43 give the possibility of the use of force, but only in an action that would have been led or authorized by the Security Council. And Article 51 which gives every country the right to legitimate defense. But if you look at the jurisprudence since, the Security Council entirely rejected the reference to Article 51, legitimate defense, when the Israelis attacked the PLO in Tunis in 1985. It rejected entirely that exception when South Africa attacked a number of their neighbors where the ANC was present. The International Court of Justice rejected the use of Article 51 in Nicaragua when the United States attacked Nicaragua. Why? Because all these institutions felt that you cannot talk of legitimate defense unless two conditions are there. First, that you need to attribute the aggression against you to the country you are attacking. So if you have Contras in one place, or if you have the PLO in Tunis, or if you have the ANC in some country, it doesn't mean that this country is entirely responsible of what this armed group is going to do. And you need that the attack against you be grave enough, severe enough, to allow you to use force against that country. So the prohibition was quite restrictive. The interpretation was always restrictive of when you can use Article 51. And when Putin used Article 51, legitimate defense, in order to justify his first attack on Ukraine in 2014, nobody was ready to follow him on that road. So the interpretation was restrictive, because the use of war, or even more, the attack and invasion and annexation, is not something that international law is happy with. However, during this deregulation of force, this prohibition has been eroded slowly, gradually, under many reasons. One big reason is, of course, the war on terror. The war on terror led to a number of resolutions in the Security Council and in the General Assembly, and I would cite in particular resolutions 1368 and 1373 after 9/11 that allow a much easier recourse to Article 51, to legitimate defense in the war on terror. And you have now for example, the Americans using that article in more than 70 countries across the world. War on terror is taking place in more than 70 countries across the world. But everybody is fighting terror. The Rwandans I was mentioning are fighting terror in Mozambique. The Chadians are fighting terror in Mali. The Turks are fighting what they consider as Kurdish terrorists in northern Iraq and northern Syria. So everybody is fighting terror. So through that hole into the prohibition, a number of things are happening that are not necessarily justified, but their sum tend to erode the principle of prohibition. Another way was the concept of preventive war that was used in Iraq by the Americans, but was also used by Putin many times. Like, if I don't stop Ukraine from joining NATO, it will join NATO, and I will have NATO on my borders. And he will continue saying, I was promised that the expansion of NATO will never take place that close to my borders. So the preventive war theory has also eroded the prohibition, although international law has not adopted the idea of preventive war, is still condemning this concept. Humanitarian action, which is the most noble of actions, of course, to go and help people in a situation of misery, is something that also has eroded, because it has introduced into the behavior of those who can intervene militarily the idea that they are serving a noble cause, which is humanitarian action. So international law has been affected, definitely has been affected by this deregulation of force. It has also affected the very concept of sovereignty. For a long time, sovereignty was a very serious matter. But now sovereignty is something that is debatable. You had three forms of sovereignty, and new countries who were born in the 20th century. And by the way, the 20th century was the century where the number of states has grown dramatically, from like fewer than 30 at the beginning of the century to 193 right now. So they are attached to that sovereignty, and they believe that sovereignty is internal, is Westphalian, and is international. Is internal in the sense that they are the only ones who rule in the country, their government. Westphalian in the sense that they can decide of what kind of value system will be imposed in their territory. And international in the sense they have a flag on the First Avenue and they are recognized by other countries. Now we are telling them, hey guys, there is a price for that. And this is a false definition of sovereignty. Sovereignty as responsibility. You need to behave in a certain way, otherwise you do not deserve that sovereignty. And that is why they are sometimes sensitive to the Chinese insistence on the concept of national sovereignty. And that's why probably not a single African country voted to condemn the Chinese behavior with its own minorities last year in the Human Rights Council. Not a single one. Possibly because they are closer to a very traditional definition of sovereignty, while this very traditional of sovereignty is being reworked in most of the West. You can see also that not only international law has been affected by this deregulation, but international relation theory has also been affected by that. You can see now that the borders between war and peace are not very clear, that the French president can come to the building on the First Avenue and say, there are 55 civil wars underway now in the world, and we should take care of them. When you start making the list, you don't know. Because some of those countries he probably has in his mind are not in a civil war, but are in a state of instability. The borders between war and peace has changed radically. And certainly the very definition of war has changed radically. In the sense that the Clausewitzian war, that was based on the fact that war takes place in a defined time, starting with the declaration of war, ending with a ceasefire, in a defined place, Jena or Austerlitz or you name it, and in a defined number of players, all this is now behind us. The very definition of war is becoming much more complex. It takes place everywhere in 70 or 80 countries, the war and terror. It takes place without a declaration of war or without a declaration of end, a cessation of hostilities. And it takes place with a number of players which are not the states. In fact, most of the fighting taking place in the world nowadays is done by non-state actors. And therefore, the whole idea of war, on which we were trained when I had your age, has changed radically right now. And this has affected certainly the international relation, theory. I would add something else that is very crucial for that theory, which is the autonomy of foreign policy. One thing that was important when states were the main players in all these games was the fact that foreign policy was independent from the nature of power you have in a country. But nowadays, this is not true. Domestic politics is affecting foreign policy in a way that has destroyed the autonomy that foreign policy has built for itself in the past few decades. Of course, I'm speaking here in telegraphic terms, and this needs to be explained in a much more detailed way. But that's a few examples of how the regulation of war has affected both international law and international relation theory as well. Now, to conclude, I would go back to the example with which I started this lecture, and that's Ukraine. A few days ago, there was a vote in the General Assembly, a vote against the annexation of the Donbass by the Russian Federation. Again, how to explain that 140 countries, which by the way, a figure that surprised even Western diplomacies, who were counting on 125 to 130 votes. Why did 140 countries voted against that annexation? So the first reading, which is legitimate, is to say it's because the Western diplomacies were very active and prepared well the vote and convinced a number of countries to vote the way they wanted. Another, probably more accurate explanation would say that there are so many countries who have worries for the integrity of their territory. So they thought of themselves first, and they said, hey, we don't want one chunk of our territory to disappear tomorrow. Why don't we try a third explanation, which is the fact that despite the fact that norms have been eroded, they didn't disappear entirely, but have been seriously eroded in the past 20 years by the behavior of powers, big and middle, there is a point where even the most adventurous countries start saying, we cannot live in a jungle. We need a norm. And they discovered that the norm that prohibits aggression, invasion, and annexation is something they badly need in their daily interaction with other countries. So, yes, there has been a deregulation of force, but there is still some place for a recognition that the world needs norms and need to continue to cultivate these norms and, if possible, to implement them. And this is my message to all countries, small and certainly more big ones. Thank you.
The floor is going to be open for questions, but I will ask the first one in a way an obvious one. So in the very last moment of your lecture, you gave us a little bit of hope, but this is a very slim hope. How in this world of deregulation of force, how do you think, what is the smart strategy to begin to rebuild norms and to strengthen them?
I think the example I gave is an example of when an individual finds that he has been walking for a long time near the precipice. There is one moment where he feels that he can fall and die. And I think the international system was irresponsibly moving toward the precipice. And that we owe it to Putin that he showed us the precipice, that we can go into the law of jungle. We can go into a world where a normless world, and a normless world means a permanent war of all against all, in fact, a Hobbesian world. So I believe that we are at a time because the Ukraine war is taking place in the middle of Europe, because the nuclear taboo is being challenged, because the fear of falling into the precipice of a world of all against all, we are starting to accept the idea that if you want some countries to behave in a certain way, you better think of the emulation process. You better be a better example in the respect of those norms.
Thank you. Floor is open. Who wants to ask the first question? Don't be shy. Lisa.
Thank you for that. It was very provocative, as always. My question is, let's assume that the governments of the world, the people at the UN, agree with you and say, we've gone too far. But you pointed out that most of the violence being perpetrated in the world today is not being perpetrated by governments, or at least there's a plausible deniability. These are non-state actors. How do you develop a normative regime or a legal regime that addresses the privatization of much of this violence? Even the Russians in Ukraine, there was a period when it wasn't clear whether they were actually formally Russian troops. So how do you address that as you think about a new kind of legal regime?
I think this is a very crucial question. It was sort of on the shelf as long as the prohibition was interpreted in a very restrictive way. Now that humanitarianism, war on terror, etc., have eroded the principle, then comes the big question. The big question is a question of attribution. To what extent states are responsible of the actions of armed groups operating in their territory? Here you have different kind of groups. In fact, it is one of the things that have made the problem more difficult to solve is the labeling of terrorism. Basically, everybody calls his enemy terrorist. So, in fact, instead of coming closer to agree on who is a terrorist, we are getting even more far apart in doing that. But you need to start saying, how do we make the attribution condition that we can attribute to a certain state the behavior of an armed group? How can we get there? I think this whole thing is very, very shallow in international law. There has not been real work on how the real criteria for attribution. At what time? Okay, it was rejected by the ICJ when it came to the American attack against Nicaragua. Okay, but when can you attribute? I think you have here three different type of things. First, if the armed group, three criteria. If the armed group is not ideologically or politically related to the country where it's operating, but only instrumentalized by that country, I think the level of attribution should be high. Second, if the armed group, is a gang, or a militia, or etc., and doesn't have a project of self-determination, it is much easier to punish the country helping that group than, say, a minority using an armed group it created in order to reach self-determination. And the third thing is the fact that when you attack that country, what do you attack in that country? Do you attack the group or do you attack the whole country? And what kind of interest do you have in that country? One of the biggest issues we found, for example, in Congo, is the fact that the Rwandans have economic interest in Eastern Congo. So the attribution here is more problematic. I mean, are you intervening in Congo in order to help reestablish peace or to help or using 51 in order to protect your own fellow countrymen, or are you pursuing some kind of imperial economic policy? So I think these three criteria and others need to be developed much more in international law in order for us to deal with this new period in our life where most of the fighting taking place now in the world is done by non-state actors. And the easiest thing, but the least fruitful thing, is to just label them terrorist group. Doesn't help in any way.
Yes.
Thank you for your talk. I want to understand a little bit more about this process of emulation. Do you think, or would you argue that the Syrian intervention in Lebanon, or the Rwandan, Ugandan, Angola, and many other countries' intervention in Congo in the 1990s were regulated uses of force? And what makes this emulation process change after post-9/11?
No, you are right. The use of force has been contemporary of human nature. It's not something new in any way. What's important is that for a period of time, like 15 years after 1990, we were building or constructing a number of norms that limited substantially the use of force. And there is this interesting book by John Eikenberry from Princeton, who said that in America in particular, after the end of the Cold War, there were three possible ways: either to retrench and retreat and say, let the world do whatever they want. Or the second option was to say, I won the Cold War, let's build on it in order to strengthen my hegemony over the whole system. Or there is a third possibility, which is to try and help, like after 1945, to build a new constitutional world order. He uses the word constitutional world order. If you are an optimist, you would say that the creation of the World Trade Organization, the creation of the International Court of Criminal Court, were signs that a new constitutional order was on the making. However, important countries, including this one, did not join the ICC. And the World Trade Organization is not in great shape right now. So there was an attempt to build a constitution and therefore to regulate war and the use of force in a much better way. And I'm not saying that what happened before was a regulated use of force. It was not a regulated use of force. It was more often than not a product of the Cold War that was taking place in different places in the whole world. But what happened is that for 15 years, around 15 years, something else was being built. And I think it disappeared in Baghdad in March 2003.
Yes? Speak up.
Everything you just explained, I think, brings up the question, practical question of reform in the UN, Security Council. So even if we have the norms and everything, so the reform of the Security Council is the most important question for me. What do you think about it?
I think I am a bit, of course, the Security Council is a reflection of the world as it was not in 1945 and is even less nowadays. Of course. So if you want the Security Council, you know, there has been a number of... what worries me is more serious. What worries me is that there is a tendency, and I would like you to go and see the circle that was distributed today by the UN for the UN Day today. There is a circle saying how the UN is important for the world. And bringing peace is one of 7 or 8 other distributing COVID vaccines, distributing polio, fighting against polio, establishing gender parity, etc., etc. What I see now is that the UN is on the verge of forgetting its main job. Its main job is peace and security. And new targets, I am not saying that all these targets are not legitimate. I mean, distributing vaccines against COVID is absolutely crucial. Establishing gender parity, I'm all for it. The problem is that I think the UN is still living in what Robert Kagan called the dream, and is not saying that peace and security, which is the main course on the UN table, has been put aside and has been replaced by a number of legitimate targets, but which are not central to the, as if peace is okay. What I'm trying to say is that the UN needs first to go back to its main job. And its main job is peace and security. And I think in the past 20 or 30 years, the UN has taken the global object, the global, how do you call them, the OGDs, a number of objectives that are good for the period I described before 2005. But since, I think, then it has been slow in going back to its main job. And its main job is peace and security. And for that, Security Council needs to be reformed, certainly. But I don't see any serious movement towards that right now.
I would be interested to hear about how optimistic or pessimistic you are for the future. Do you see the surprisingly strong international condemnation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine this year as potentially marking a watershed moment? Or do you believe that we will continue to see escalating deregulation of these forces?
I think it will be crucial to see how those who condemn Russia today are going to behave themselves in the future. That will give credibility or not to the fact that they are re-establishing the validity of a norm or just punishing one leader or one country. I'm not saying they shouldn't be punished. I'm just saying, how do they behave later? If you look at Ukraine as a sort of case isolated from what happened in the past 20 years, then you punish Putin or you punish Russia and then you turn the page and you continue to behave the way you behaved further. No. If you do not only punish the aggressor, but call for and behave in a way that says it has been punished because a norm has been violated, it's a completely different manner. So, yes, optimism and pessimism, I'm an active pessimist in my life. I believe that the word human nature is not necessarily good, but I think that this should not lead you to passivity. Quite to the contrary, to be very active in trying to alleviate that. I believe that the behavior of the West in particular will be crucial in the months and years following a peace, if it ever comes in Ukraine, in order to make it an example, the way it was done in Kuwait. You know, in Kuwait, in 1990, you had 12 UN Security Council allowing the US to lead the war against Iraq. And you had committees that were formed in order to compensate Kuwait for the aggression. And you had the idea that this could lead to a new world order. And there were reasons to believe that this was possible. And I think we missed the opportunity. If the Ukraine war ends without a change in the behavior of those who would have punished Russia, we would miss another opportunity.
Yes, and after that.
Very quickly, Professor, two questions. The first one would be, why why the UN didn't benefit from this deregulation of the use of force. Maybe I'm the child of NAFTA, and I understand deregulation as being more flexible and less constrained by rules. So how come the UN was always constrained by the interpretation of the principles of the Charter? And second, wouldn't you say that this emulation process was also a legitimacy crisis of the maybe perceived Western values of international norms and rules, and it's the challenges come not as an imitation process, but more as a challenge to the rules that maybe these emerging powers don't perceive as their own?
Well, the easy answer is to say that the UN doesn't exist outside the will of these countries in control of that organization. The organization, especially when it comes to peace and security, needs to go to one institution, that's the Security Council. And in the Security Council, there are 5 countries who have a veto power. And therefore, when France was fighting in Algeria, the Security Council could not do anything because the Security Council was handicapped by a French veto. And when Russia today attacks Ukraine, the Security Council can do. So this is a price we are paying for the fact that we wanted, in 1945, 2 different things. We wanted the whole world to come together into an organization, but we also wanted to create some kind of a concert, like the concert of Europe of the 19th century. And it created this hybrid institution, which is the Security Council, that needs to be reformed for good. I think the UN and the ICJ were right in having a restrictive interpretation of the prohibition of the use of force. I think that the ICJ and the Security Council did not take into consideration the deregulation of force now in order to re-establish what Lisa was mentioning, criteria, new criteria, in order to implement that prohibition.
Let's take last few questions. So Michael, I see 4 questions, so maybe we lump them together. So Michael and then all the others. Yeah, start.
So, first of all, thank you so much. My question is about the regulation of force in Libya in particular. It's 2 parts. One is you mentioned these 3 vehicles of liberalism, and it seems to me that all of the countries currently engaged in Libya using use of force have those trends of liberalism: Egypt, Russia, Turkey, Qatar. Do you see a relationship between those trends towards liberalism and the entrenchment of conflict in the countries where those political countries are engaged in support? And relatedly, with the new UN envoy in Libya and the roadmap that we had helped to orchestrate now being solved, do you see a sort of way forward operational roadmap?
Okay, let's get the other questions. Yes?
Thank you, Professor. I was just hoping to ask you about your position of the United States in relation to international law. It strikes me that since I moved here, I've been on Ireland, the Ireland multinational system a lot. So to come here and find Americans feel very differently about international law and U.S. adherence to it. I'm wondering if you think that there's any opportunity for a recalculation of the U.S.'s relationship to international law.
Okay, yes.
And I think like my question is sort of related to that. So I was just wondering, with the UN moving back to the peace and security mandate, how possible do you think that is, as long as UN actually depends heavily on financing from countries? And a lot of the times, as you mentioned, domestic politics are in a lot of ways, like a lot of ways, a barrier to actually progressive international policy. And yeah, kind of how that financing part actually plays into the sport.
Okay, and the last question.
And when talking about the deregulation of force, one player you haven't mentioned at all is the European Union. So I wonder what you think about the
potential role of the European Union, which is still a sizable economic power, in the building of the new state world order and like its role in fighting the deregulation, of course,
Well,
Four
how much
great
time do we have?
2 hours.
No, no. 5
No,
minutes?
I think we
3
have,
minutes?
we have roughly 5 minutes. Yeah,
Okay,
5, 6
okay,
minutes.
okay, because these are very different questions. Let me address the first one, the second one, in fact, first. There is a school in America that does not believe in the very existence of international law. I have in my personal library books that say that, and the former representative, U.S. representative of the UN, John Bolton, has written a beautiful essay on the non-existence of international law. So you can go that far by saying international law is an invention. In fact, it's a customary. International law does not exist. Who's the judge? Who's the policeman? Who's the, I mean, unlike domestic law, international law does not exist. I happen to be on the side of the American Society for International Law that produces the journal that believes there is an international law and has contributed strongly to that tradition. But it is true that America has a divided view of the very existence of international law. And I am not going to mention names, but there are also politicians who do not believe in international law, only believe in bilateral relations. And but this has to do with the tradition of this country. You have a tradition that is institution building, Wilsonian, etc., and you have another one that is unilateralist, that is, etc. And that is an example, in fact, of what I was mentioning in my lecture, of the erosion in the autonomy of foreign policy. Foreign policy was to a large extent immune to domestic evolution in the United States. This is no more the case right now. Right now, domestic politics in America and the most domestic demographics as well are affecting foreign policy in a big way. And it is the same, of course, in smaller countries across the world. As for the finances of the UN, you are right. You are right. The UN doesn't have, does not impose taxation on anybody, and it needs the contribution of the states. But the states have also committed not only to give money, but to respect somehow the autonomy of the various organizations, the UNGA, the Security Council, etc. What I see is that the fact that big powers have been involved in wars like the US in Iraq or Russia in Ukraine, etc., has sidelined to a large extent the UN. But it doesn't mean, and nowadays most of the blue berets operate in countries rather, I mean, not in big countries, mainly in Africa. So it will be bad if the Security Council is only a mechanism to produce blue berets for small countries or for poor countries. That would also be a devaluation of the 1945 hope. So it's very important that the UN become again a place where the relation among big powers is debated, not necessarily publicly, but is debated among themselves. And this is not happening right now. There is one way of alleviating that. If you have, somebody was mentioning the appointment of my successor in Libya. If you can enclave certain issues, accept the idea that big powers are today diverging rather than converging, and then say, but let this issue be dealt with by the big powers independently, otherwise from their very horrible relations, bilateral relations. This could be an alleviating factor until some kind of harmony comes back to the relation among them. Libya is a big issue. Is a big issue. What I want to say is that the easiest thing is to look at foreign interference in any conflict, because it's reported in the press usually of the country that is sending. But it's much more difficult to understand domestic dynamics. And in Libya, domestic dynamics are crucial, But they are hard to understand. I had to bring back the mission into Tripoli and to go and live there and interact for almost 3 years with the Libyans to start to understand that. I'm not saying I understood it all, but to start to understand the vitality of the domestic dynamics. It's easy to say Turkey intervened in Libya and brought a few hundred Turkmens from Syria and sent them there. Okay, it's in the press. Everybody knows that. But what is happening there? I had to live for days and days, and especially nights and nights, with the then Prime Minister to understand why he invited the Turks to come and what kind of dynamics he was into it as somebody who didn't have his own armed groups and etc. The extreme difficulty with which he reached that discussion and that decision, and how it could have been avoided in the first place, were it not for the attack that started against his main city. So my advice to all of you is that to keep in mind that for scholars, for journalists, for externals in general, foreign interference is the easiest thing to catch, but to be the easiest does not mean to be the most important one. And local domestic factors need to be understood at least as well, but they are hardly understandable just by reading the New York Times. Thank you all.
European